Well, hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Kyiv. The headlines. Russian President Vladimir Putin says special military operation in Ukraine could take a long time. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky claims Russian shelling kills 10 in East Ukraine, calling the strikes very fierce and absolutely calculated. EU Commission proposes 9th package of sanctions against Russia. We'll start off with the military campaign in Ukraine, which Russia says may go on for a while. Well, these are the words of the president, specifically Vladimir Putin, indicating that what he calls Russia's special military operation in Ukraine could be a long process. Putin was speaking via video link to a meeting with the Council for Civil Society and Human Rights. Addressing a question about the duration of hostilities that escalated in February, Putin said that achieving all the objectives will take time, but pointed to what he called several major gains already won.
Regarding the long process of achieving the results of the special military operation, of course, it can be a long process. You've mentioned gaining new territories. It's a meaningful result. After all, for Russia, it's a serious issue.
And staying with that meeting that the Human Rights Council, the Russian president railed against the West and denied rumors that Moscow was planning a second round of mobilization for the conflict. Mr. Putin says there was no need to conduct an additional call-up of Russian reservists to fight in Ukraine at the moment. He adds that more than 300,000 Russian reservists who were drafted in what Moscow called a partial mobilization in September and October, 150,000 were deployed in the zone of what Moscow calls its special military operation in Ukraine. Of those, 77,000 were in combat units and the remainder performing defensive functions. Putin also said that Russia will fight to defend its interests using all available means. In the meantime, President Vladimir Putin says the risk of a nuclear war was rising, but insisted that Russia had not gone mad and that it saw its own nuclear arsenal as a purely defensive deterrent. But nevertheless, President Putin said Russia will defend its territory and its allies with all available means, adding that it was the United States and not Russia that had deployed so-called tactical nuclear weapons in other countries. Well, let's turn now to Ukraine, where the President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russian shelling killed 10 people and wounded many others in the town of Kharkov in eastern Kyiv. While speaking in his usual nightly address, Zelensky described the attack on the town as very fierce and absolutely calculated. He said that these were peaceful people, ordinary people. Kirilo Timoshenko, who's the deputy head of Zelensky's office, had earlier denounced the attack in a post on social media.
Today, the Russian army struck Kurakovi. Very fierce, absolutely calculated, especially at peaceful people, at ordinary people. On the market, a grain elevator, a petrol station, a bus station, and on a residential building. Presently, the list of dead stands at 10, with many injured. My condolences to relatives and friends. Eternal memory to all victims of Russian terror. We are constantly increasing the generation and supply of electricity. We are increasing the volume almost every day. But we should not forget, and everyone should not forget, that it is now impossible to restore 100% of the energy system to how it was before the beginning of the Russian energy terror. Time is needed. That is why scheduled blackouts continue in most cities and districts.
Well, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says Russia was trying to have some kind of freeze of this war with Ukraine in order to prepare for a bigger offensive next spring. Speaking at an interview with Financial Times Global Boardroom, Stoltenberg said the Russian military will try to regroup, repair, recover ahead of such an attack. He expressed support for the Ukrainian right for self-defense, and when asked if the conditions for a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine were met, Stoltenberg said they were not, because Russia has shown no sign of engaging in negotiations which are respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine.
What we see now is that Russia is actually attempting to try to have some kind of freeze of this war, at least for a short period of time, so they can regroup, repair, recover, and then try to launch a bigger offensive next spring. So what we do is that we support Ukraine in their right for self-defense. Ukraine is defending their own country, and NATO allies and partners are providing unprecedented support to those efforts by the Ukrainians.
Well, the European Commission has proposed a 9th package of sanctions on Russia over its invasion of Ukraine that will include almost 200 more individuals and entities on the EU sanction list. Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said it favored new sanctions against 3 additional Russian banks and new export controls and restrictions, especially for dual-use goods like key chemicals, nerve agents, electronics, and its components. She added that the 8 packages of sanctions the EU had introduced so far were already biting hard, and now the bloc wanted to raise the pressure on Russia with a 9th package.
Bring death and devastation to Ukraine. It is deliberately targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. It is seeking to paralyze the country at the beginning of the winter. But we stand by Ukraine, and we will make Russia pay for its cruelty. The 8 packages of sanctions that we have issued so far are already biting hard. But today we are stepping up the pressure on Russia with a 9th package of sanctions. First, we are proposing to add almost 200 additional individuals and entities to our sanctions list. This includes the Russian armed forces, as well as individual officers and defense industrial companies, but also members of the State Duma, of the Federation Council, ministers, governors, and political parties among them. This list covers key figures in Russia's brutal and deliberate missile strikes against civilians and in the kidnapping of Ukrainian children to Russia. Second, we propose to introduce sanctions against 3 additional Russian banks. This includes a full transaction ban on the Russian Regional Development Bank to further dry out Putin's war chest. And third, we also want to impose new export controls and restrictions, particularly for dual-use goods. This includes, for example, key chemicals or nerve agents, electronics, IT components, all what could be used by the Russian war machine. My 4th point, we will cut Russia's access to all sorts of drones and UAVs. We propose to ban the direct exports of drone engines to Russia and the export to any third countries, such as Iran, which could supply drones to Russia. We will also target the Russian propaganda machine by taking 4 additional channels off the air and all other distribution platforms. And we propose further economic measures against the Russian energy and mining sector, including a ban on new mining investments in Russia.
The United Nations Human Rights Office says at least 441 civilians have been killed by Russian forces in the early days of Moscow's invasion of Ukraine, documenting summary executions and attacks in dozens of towns across the 3 regions. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights says in a report that the actual number of victims in Kyiv, Chernihiv and Sumy regions was likely to be much higher, looking into the invasion start on February the 24th until early April, when Russian forces withdrew from the three areas. Well, through the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, the OHCHR gathered evidence from 102 towns and villages.
By the end of October, our monitoring mission in Ukraine had documented cases of summary executions and attacks on individual civilians in 102 villages and towns of the three regions, Kyiv, Chernihiv and Sumy. The killings took place between the 24th of February and the 6th of April and were committed by Russian armed forces while they controlled these areas. We documented the deaths of 441 civilians, which includes 341 men, 72 women, 20 boys and 8 girls. We are still in the process of corroborating an additional 198 alleged killings in these areas. There are strong indications that the summary executions documented in the report may constitute the war crime of willful killing, as the circumstances surrounding these deaths suggest that Russian soldiers knew that they were targeting civilians but still used lethal force. Russian soldiers brought civilians to makeshift places of detention and then executed them in captivity. Many of the victims' bodies were found with their hands tied behind their backs and gunshot wounds to their heads. Some victims were summarily executed on the spot. Civilians were targeted on roads while moving within or between settlements, including while attempting to flee the hostilities.
We have also information that continues to emerge about summary executions, torture, arbitrary detention, enforced disappearances, and sexual violence against women, girls, and men. Each day, we receive information about war crimes. The scale of civilian casualties, as well as the significant damage and destruction to civilian objects, including hospitals and schools, is shocking. And I saw that yesterday myself in Izum.
David, who is a fellow International Institute of Professional Security, a fellow Institute of Security of Nigeria, and certified protection officer from International Foundation of Protection, CPO, Florida. He joins us virtually from Lagos. Good morning, and thank you for joining us on the program. Well, let's begin with...
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
Absolutely. Let's begin with President Putin's recent statement saying that, well, this will take a long time. And I wonder how significant this is really, because some will say we had already said that, we had already projected that. But then NATO now saying that, well, what Russia is trying to do is freeze this war and then launch a much more bigger and coordinated attack. So with President Putin saying this is going to take long, I wonder, is this significant really in the whole scheme of things, seeing how far we have come?
Well, I'm happy that we have been following up, and I want to give credit to channels for giving this a dedicated coverage. Now, you follow up on all our comments, you see that we are really driving towards our presumptions. Now, the people of Ukraine, they are resilient. They are resilient beyond being the fact that they have global sympathy. So if the attacks are not giving the appropriate feedback to the Russian expectation, definitely it is due to all the other factors that were not properly captured by the Russian defense strategic team. Now, I believe that definitely the Ukrainian resilience will continue, and the global sympathy will continue, and the Russians will have a long day.
So you think no matter how long it takes, all of these things will go parallel with them and go as long as it goes for? Interestingly, the Russian president had to say Russia is not mad. I wonder why he had to make that statement. Perhaps he senses that the world has that feeling, or at least a section of the world. So also regarding that comment, him particularly saying, well, Russia is not mad. The nuclear arsenal we have is for our protection, saying that it's actually the US that is really causing all of this in some sense. Do you think it was important for him to make that statement, that Russia is not mad?
Well, last time I told you about underground negotiations with the Russian economy and the survivability of Russia beyond this war. And I told you that Russia is definitely into deep discussions, negotiations, and personal compromise to China, Iran, and every other country, even financial institutions. You heard just recently they are going to be sanctioning some banks. You know, all of these people are taking their chunk out of Russia, and they are tactically pushing Russia to the point where it begins to make threats about its missiles. Now, this statement I had from Putin is clearly not to us. It is to those that are in negotiation with it, those that are in parley with it, those that are signing contracts, underground agreements with Russia, which are going to be a long haul in the cold for Russia.
Well, it looks like they might need to add the 9th sanctions, it would seem, this sanction package. And I'm just wondering, if the 8th package was effective, or I imagine it was effective based on what the authorities have said, saying that it is biting harder for Russia. Why the need for a 9th package? And the question then will be, yes, this 9th package is coming up. How effective would it be coming off what we have seen with the 8th package, addition of 200 people? Some would ask, why not even have all those sanctions together and do it once, give a major blow? So how effective do you think this 9th sanction will be? Don't forget, we're coming from 1, 2, up until 8th.
Yeah, you know, the first discussion we had, I told you about tightening the noose. Now, when you keep tightening the noose, you go out to remove your views from the men at the forefront, you remove your views from the missiles flying, you remove your views from the drones flying, you begin to look at complications within the capacity and capability of Russia. Now, if you look at these 9 packages that they are going to use to increase the tightening of the noose, you will see that there are underground investigations and detection on the capability of Russia to gain excessive control of economy, supply of weapons, artillery, and financial businesses control. Now, there are a lot of business cartels in Russia, businessmen cartels, that have also supported the government. Now, this tightening of noose is also going to remove all the magazines from their chamber and make them ineffective. And this is going to weaken the ability of Russia to be making such declarations on Ukraine.
Quite interesting illustration there, removing the magazine from their chambers. But let's try to wind down on this point, the energy cap, which Russia said there will be an energy ground instead, or an energy floor in this case. I wonder how that comes into play as well with this, do I say, 9th sanction package. Do you think it is all part of the tightening the noose? Don't forget Russia's response, saying there will be a floor instead. And to a large extent, as you said, Russia still has, economies, nations that they have deals with, that they sign these deals with and do business with. So how do you think it will affect this 9th sanction package and the news which you talk about?
Well, for your information, the energy crisis will wane out very soon. Remember about the COVID-19, and during that COVID-19 onslaught, that was the time that Iran was also threatening to release nukes in the world, and with the onset of the COVID-19 and the new global order, those threats fizzled out. Now, as I speak to you, the energy crisis is going global. It's already in the UK, it's already in every other country, and people are exercising interest in alternative energy supply. Once there is need and desire there must be creativity and progress. So I assure you that that will be put aside very soon. Now let's look at the economies. I'm very interested in that weapon because the survivability of every Western world depends on its access to global spaces and its relevance in global spaces. Don't forget that Russia is bold and proud, and to negotiate with any other country, it needs to give so much to take so little. And I assure you that there are no friendly country in the world. Iran and China and those that are negotiating with Russia to bring in supplies, they are not negotiating in the favor of Russia. But what Ukraine is getting from Germany and US and the UK is actually motivated by humanity. And this is a key angle that you need to understand. So I beg to agree with you that Russia should begin to look at serious talks to remove itself from all the constraints of economic entanglements that it will arrive at after this war.
Well, the negotiations bit, let's just touch on that. We're winding down now. It's been said that the mere fact that Russia is invading Ukraine is a sign of bad faith, that it shows that, in fact, Russia is not ready for negotiation. Well, Russia has said it is ready for negotiation. There have been negotiations attended by Russia. So do you think that Russia is still in good stead to follow through with negotiations? Because I know that this is being fought on different grounds. There's the sanctions tightening the news. There's also the hope that negotiations will yield something. So I wonder for you, where do you think that the results will come out from? Is it the sanctions or the negotiations? Which do you think would yield the fruits that we all desire, which I imagine is peace?
Okay, thank you very much. Let me begin to speak on the part of Russia right now. Now, if I'm within the Russian catchment, my thoughts will begin to follow on patterns of negotiation, catchment of negotiation. Remember, there was a negotiation for the wheat and the grains to be able to leave Ukraine, you know, and the channels of export of grains, because of the global interests and world hunger predictions. Now, if you want to go into further negotiations, I will advise the Russian teams to begin to look at the 9-point agenda of restriction and begin to look at how they can bring other interests to wear into negotiations on those axes. For an example now, some of those financial constraints that are tagged in the 9-point agenda could lead to other countries' disablement, financial disablement. So those countries can also bring a case and begin to say, this your 9-point agenda is going to affect XYZ countries, is going to affect XYZ processes of human existence. So that should be their axis. If they begin to look at it from there, the US and the UK will begin to pipe low on some of those strong lines, and they will win some carrots.
Well, it's been an interesting conversation. We've been speaking with Roy Ohidivere, who's a fellow, International Institute of Professional Security. Thank you so much for your time on the program.
Always a pleasure, sir. Thank you.
Well, after the break, the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, says no question of Russian involvement in German coup plot. So details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back now to the United Kingdom, where the National Farmers Union is warning that the UK is sleepwalking into a food supply crisis and the government must step in to help farmers. Yields of tomatoes and other crops will likely slump to record lows this year, it said, with potential supply problems ahead, as already seen with eggs. It adds that soaring fuel, fertilizer and feed costs were putting farmers under severe pressure. Meanwhile, the government says the UK has a highly resilient food supply chain. For some supermarkets are rationing egg sales after farmers cut back or halted production because of rising costs, a situation made worse by the avian flu outbreak. However, the NFU warned that food prices in other areas were now facing difficulties. It said yields of energy-intensive crops like tomatoes, cucumbers and pears were likely to hit their lowest level this year since records began in 1985. It also said milk prices were likely to fall below the cost of production, while beef farmers were considering reducing the number of cows they breed. Rising costs were to blame, it said, with fertilizer prices for farmers more than tripling since 2019 and the cost of feed and diesel up by 75%. Soaring energy costs, Brexit red tape, and worker shortages were also factors, it added. Well, let's talk to our London correspondent, Juliana Olainka, who joins us from our London studio. Well, Juliana, good morning. I mean, talking about food that much reminds me that, it's breakfast time for a lot of people, and having to go through high cost of living, I just wonder how they're getting by. And it brings me to the point, how exactly is the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, helping the people in the UK as regards to high cost of living?
Well, good morning, Kaide. I think we've been talking about the energy crisis and the cost of living issue for several months from this studio. But I think this week it really is starting to hit home. And that's because anybody who travels to the UK knows that you can't have a conversation without talking about the weather. And it is exceptionally cold right now. I'm kind of, closing my chest because it is freezing. It's -3. The Met Office have issued a severe weather warning, not just to households, but to the NHS as well, telling them to brace themselves and expect to see lots of patients. And it is going to get bitterly cold in the next coming days. Why is that important? Because, of course, when it is cold, you want to, ramp up your thermostat in your homes. And that is a problem at the moment because energy costs are so high. There is a £25 million communications campaign which will be rolled out over the next few days. So again, any of our viewers in the UK will be seeing billboards, radio adverts, TV adverts, advising them on how they can be more energy conscious, which means not using your heat during certain times of the day. But people need to use it because, of course, it's freezing. But the issue is the supply of gas, which we know has been made acute everywhere, but particularly an issue in the UK. I believe yesterday, Joe Biden, the US President, and Rishi Sunak, the UK Prime Minister, did actually sign a new deal where the US is going to be supplying more energy to the UK so we can start weaning ourselves off from gas within the continent. But it is a major issue, and it remains a major talking point here in Britain. We know that Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak's predecessor, did put in place this energy support scheme. It was supposed to last for 2 years, meaning that if you were, living in an average household, you wouldn't be paying more than £2,500 a year. Now, when Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, came in, that was ripped up, and we've only got that now for 6 months. So at least for 6 months, energy bills for most people will be low. But £2,500 a year is still much more than it was pre the illegal invasion of Ukraine, where it was just about £1,000. So people are really struggling, and it comes at a time when it is bitterly cold. We had a pretty warm October, a warm November, but now, I think the energy crisis is likely to bite, and it's going to be a huge migraine for the Conservative government.
Indeed. And speaking to our previous guest, he was quite hopeful, I'll just say optimistic, that the energy crisis will end soon. And I wonder for you, seeing the progression, what the government is saying, how the people are responding, do you share that optimism as well?
Well, I remain optimistic as much as I can, but you know what the British press are like here. It's the fourth pillar of the establishment, and sometimes it can be pretty much a media frenzy. We're just talking about the National Farmers Union and the warning that they've said about crops and issues with supplies. We know that supplies issues are not just a British issue. This is an issue that's been caused, offset by the pandemic, and that's pushed up fresh food inflation to 14.5%. That's one of the highest inflations we've had on record. What does that mean? It means that there are a lot of households coming up to Christmas that are just not going to be having the same Christmas dinner that they've had had in previous times. We're also going through a huge winter of discontent at the moment. So this is all aside from the fact that it's exceptionally cold in Britain and people can't afford to pay their energy bills. A lot of people are not happy with how they're being treated at work. They're not happy with jobs, pays and conditions. There are coordinated strike actions currently taking place up and down the land of the British Isles, with people saying that, you know, they want their wages to be increased. They want to be able to pay for their bills. They don't want to be working 40, sometimes 50 hours a week, getting paid, but that money is still not being enough to put food on your table. There's been so many research released by food banks and think tanks, the Resolution Foundation being one of them, showing that nurses, for example, are one of the highest recipients of food from food banks. So whilst we remain optimistic and whilst we can see that the world, particularly the G7 and the G20 when they met recently, are trying to come together to try and find ways so that the world won't be held ransom by the Kremlin, there are other domestic issues at play here. So I think Britain still has a long way off until we're going to get ourselves out of this situation, and particularly if you go back to what we heard a couple of weeks ago from Andrew Bailey, the Bank of England governor. He has said, and he's forecast, that we are going to be in the longest recession that we've seen, even before the financial crisis. So optimism, yes, but cautious optimism is probably a little bit better, Kaide.
I know, it's always good to have that optimism, right? I'd like you to maybe help us understand how people are then coping in these circumstances. Right here, the temperature is what, 32 degrees. I know you'll probably do anything to have that kind of temperature where you're at, but looking at your side, -3, between -3 and 4 degrees, that's a lot. So how are people actually coping for the temperature with the high cost of living? How are people maybe practically going by or getting through this period?
Well, there is a saying that common sense is not common. So, you know, one thing I do want to do is urge, especially our elder viewers who may be watching, you know, listening in the UK, please, please, please put the heating on. Please put the heating on, you know. Do make sure you wrap up warm, especially young mothers as well who may be watching, maybe getting pretty afraid about your high energy bill. Put your heating on and cover up your baby. That's the first thing I would like to say. And, you know, as I was explaining, the British government are putting out a £25 million infomercial campaign, as it could be described, just advising people on how they can be more energy sufficient. There are also some suggestions as well that it's probably cheaper to have an electric heater. So this is a heater that you can plug in your wall. It's like a mini radiator that you can use to keep yourself warm. Yes, your electricity bill might be higher, but I think it may be much cheaper than keeping your gas on all day. That's the first thing. I know as well a lot of churches, I think this has been led by the Archbishop of Canterbury. They started a new campaign of calling warm spaces. So I believe last month about 80,000 people across the 4 nations were using these warm spaces. So these are churches, these are football stadiums from the inside, community hubs, where people, you know, if you are struggling to pay your bills and you are worried about putting your heater on, you can go to these warm spaces and stay there and, you know, speak to your fellow neighbours just about some of the issues you have. Now, we have had these in previous years, but the increase in usage of these spaces has surged about 70%. So it is an issue. I think what the government would say is that they're doing the best that they can. I believe there was a £400 rebate for every household, so including the very, very wealthy. So what people will be seeing, and I think this started in October, it will continue until March, about £67 a month being taken off your bill. This comes automatically. If you're somebody that doesn't pay via direct debit and you use a card meter or an old-fashioned key, then you will see in your meter that money is being added up to the tune of £400, about £70 a month. Then, of course, there was the one-off cost of living payment that was paid into instalments. And if you are disabled, if you are elderly, or if you receive receive no income, there is government support along the way. So help is at hand, at least for the energy bills. But then, as I've been explaining, Kayode, there are so many other issues that Britain is having to face with. You know, Britain certainly isn't the milk of land and honey, the land of milk and honey. It is really, really, really difficult for many people at the moment. But as we said, we try to remain optimistic and hope that this cold Arctic spell will pass sometime soon. Even as I'm talking to you right now, Kayode, I am literally freezing. It is so cold. My toes cannot move. It's -3. It's likely to be -10 by the weekend. So I think that the most important message, particularly if you are somebody who is easily scared by the scaremongering of the media, wrap up warm. And if you can put your heating on, do put your heating on, and go to your local Citizens Advice Bureau website. You will see options listed of how the government will be supporting you, because there is support. Not enough, but there is something out there to make sure you don't freeze at the moment, because this is a critical health warning. Extreme heat can kill, but also extreme cold can kill, particularly the elderly. So yes, that's the message I would like to give to our viewers.
I mean, quite dire picture you painted. More than anything, Juliana, you and the team, please stay warm. I mean, that's what we want. We want you to do just fine. I know amidst all of this, there's also the politics going on. So just quickly, so we can let you go. Rishi Sunak settling into office and coping with domestic trouble, season of discontent, political future of Conservatives after recent election loss. All of this coming together, can you just give us more briefly?
Yes, well, you know, Rishi Sunak is still dancing his political dance. Some would accuse him of trying to appease the party rather than trying to appease the country. Of course, it's going to be difficult because he is, as much as he is popular, he can't appease everybody. I think the two major talking points in the coming days are going to be about the energy crisis. Firstly, yesterday, there was some late night breaking news about a new coal mine that has been given the green light by the Levelling Up Secretary, Michael Gove. This is incredibly controversial. It comes just a couple of weeks after Sharm el-Sheikh COP27, suggesting that we were going to reduce our emissions. We're not going to be able to do that if we start firing up coal. And it goes completely against Boris Johnson's legacy and him trying to be a clean, green prime minister. He said the days of coal are over. According to Rishi Sunak, they are not over. And he is going to be opening this new coal mine. That is very controversial. And then, of course, the strikes. The striking is a huge issue. 100,000 nurses are going to be striking over 2 days in a couple of weeks, Kayode. This comes at a time when the NHS is already creaking. You know, we're seeing and hearing that ambulances are waiting outside of hospitals with very sick patients for up to 11 hours. Up to 11 hours. They want more money. The government said they can't afford to pay them. They're going to down tools. What is going to be the aftermath of this, particularly when you add it up to all of the other sectors? So things aren't great. You know, I think the retail sector as well, really on the verge of breaking. They are hoping that they can recoup some of the lost trading throughout the year in December, but there are going to be rail strikes. If there are rail strikes, people are not going to be coming into London. If it's too cold, people are not going to be coming into London. So a multitude of issues as we, you know, wait for the new year. And of course, are we in a recession? New GDP figures out next week will let us know.
Well, Juliana, I must say it's inspiring and emotional for me, seeing you being at your very best in spite of the cold. I mean, freezing toast. Thank you so much. And please stay warm, all right?
Thank you, Kayode. Yes, I'll put a blazer on.
You should. Well, when we return, Kyiv mayor says apocalypse scenario possible this winter, but then urges not to panic. Join us again. Well, welcome back. Ladi Williams joins me now in the studio to discuss the business angle to this. Ladi, good morning. You know, I'm just really grateful for the heat. You know, we complain about heat here. Yeah. I'm quite grateful now. I am. Well, you know, the temperatures may be dropping, I mean, across Europe, but interestingly, we've seen consumer prices actually rising sharply in the week up until December the 5th. What's responsible? Did it get the memo from the cold?
I know, right? But, this is more from, Russia now. We're seeing, obviously this is a country, at war. And we've seen how, the ruble has fared with all the sanctions. We've seen how they've used capital controls to, try to keep the economy, strong. But they've not been able to keep it from inflation, because we know inflation is a global, phenomenon right now. It's what's impacting most countries, at this time. And we've seen the week to December 5th, because they check theirs, on a weekly basis, and we've seen it go up about 0.58% from about 0.19, percent. So we're seeing that rising inflation is still, an issue there in Russia. But we know the central bank in Russia did cut rates. They went on that, rate cutting rampage. The last time they had to raise rates really high, over 20%, when they invaded Ukraine, and we saw the sanctions, mounting on them. So now they've eased on, rate cutting at this time. Analysts are also expecting they will still keep, maintain the rate about 7.5%, going forward at the last meeting. Everyone's looking forward to that meeting, same way they're looking forward to, the Fed meeting. But, we're seeing that inflation rate go up, on a weekly basis. So obviously the central bank is going to find ways to, keep it lower, because at the end of the day, they're paying more, for goods and services, in the country. And we know that they're going through a lot right now, even though the economy might look strong, but there are a lot of cracks in there.
Over in Ukraine, there's also the economic angle as well. And it looks like Ukraine is set to hold rates. I don't know if they are checking books of Russia, if they agree on this one. But decision day guide, walk us through it.
Yeah, so they had to raise it to about 25%. From 10% the last, and they've maintained that 25% for a while now, because obviously, a country at war, obviously inflation is going to skyrocket. So they had to raise rates steeply, 25%, big one. So they've maintained that, all through the year, and it's expected they will leave it at that level, because at the end of the day, they still want to maintain, the economy. We don't want inflation to skyrocket, even though we know that they've been getting a lot of aid from, most of these countries, to, keep the economy stable. So analysts are expecting they're going to keep the rates at that 25%. They're not expecting a cut, not expecting, an increase, just to maintain stability at this point. And obviously, we know that grain deal still going on, so they're still able to, make some money selling those grains, even though most of their key energy facilities have been hit hard, from Russia, and that's really impacted the economy. It's biting really hard. So they're expecting that, going forward, the country will maintain, these rates at 25%.
I know there's so much to cover, really, but we have a full hour of you, because I recall the monetary and fiscal battle in Russia on cryptocurrency, the authorities. But let's leave that for your show in the coming minutes. Thank you so much, Ladi, for walking us through some of these major business developments. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Let's move on now. In another development, 25 people have been arrested in raids across Germany on suspicion of plotting to overthrow the government. Well, the group of far-right and ex-military figures are said to have prepared for what was described as Day X to storm the parliament building and seize power. The Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, says there could be no question of any Russian involvement in an alleged far-right plot to overthrow the German state. Well, Peskov told reporters that, quote, "This appears to be an internal problem for Germany. There can be no question of any Russian interference." Well, German prosecutors said one of the accused had reached out to the representatives of Russia, which the group saw as its central contact for establishing a new order. They said there was no evidence the representatives had responded positively to the request. Well, the mayor of Kyiv warned of an apocalypse scenario for the Ukrainian capital this winter. That's if Russian airstrikes on infrastructure continue, but said there was no need for residents to evacuate now, though they should be ready to do so. Mayor Vitaly Klitschko says Kyiv might lose power, water, and heat supply. The apocalypse might happen, like in Hollywood films, when it's not possible to live in homes, considering the low temperature. It says, went on to say, we are fighting and doing everything we can to make sure that this does not happen. The former boxer went on to say, raising his booming voice to drive the point home, that the picture is bleak. The capital lacks enough heated shelters to take in all 3.6 million residents in the event of complete outages, and people should be ready to evacuate if the situation worsens. Klitschko, who is a former world heavyweight boxing champion before entering politics, painted a picture of a harsh future ahead for Ukraine's more than 1,500-year-old capital. He sketched out one possible scenario in which the city could be left without central heating until spring, at a time when temperatures can fall as low as minus 15 degrees Celsius. To sports now. The International Olympics Committee has admitted that the participation of Russian and Belarusian athletes at the 2024 Paris Summer Olympics is still unclear, and no date has been set for a final decision on the matter. About 100,000 athletes around the world will be trying to qualify in the coming year and a half for the Games, with about 10,000 eventually expected to attend. It is unclear, however, if and how athletes from Russia and Belarus will be able to compete both in the qualification process and the Games themselves. IOC President Thomas Bach says that the ban of those athletes was not part of the sanctions, but was a protective measure. Well, the ATP has fined Britain's Lawn Tennis Association, the LTA, $1 million for banning male players from Russia and Belarus from this year's grass court event ahead of the championships over Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. Players were banned from the UK grass court tournament held in the build-up to Wimbledon, which became the first Grand Slam tournament to ban individual competitors from the two countries. The ATP said in April that the unilateral decision by Wimbledon to exclude players from Russia and Belarus was unfair and could potentially set a damaging precedent for the game. And that's the program for this morning. Thank you for joining us. I'm Kayode Okikilu. Goodbye.